Identify yourself. Are you Elara Quinn, Falcon 7?
I haven't heard that name in 8 years.
Elara Quinn saved a life in a civilian hospital using hands that weren't supposed to exist. Hands the military buried 8 years ago along with her name. Now black helicopters descend on the roof, soldiers call out a codename she swore she'd never hear again. And the one man who fought to clear her record is bleeding out. She has minutes to decide. Return to the system that erased her. Or let him die. Welcome to Golden Heart Stories. This is the story of a woman the world tried to erase and what happened when the past came back to claim her. Director Lionel Crest's office smelled of leather and coffee gone cold. Elara Quinn stood before his desk, dried blood crusted dark on her sleeves. Watching him read her termination letter with the detachment of a man ordering lunch. The overhead lights hummed. Outside the window, clouds hung heavy and gray over the parking lot. Crest's fingers tapped the paper in a rhythm that spoke of impatience rather than regret. He cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses, and began reading in a voice smooth as polished stone. His eyes never quite met hers as he spoke, focusing instead on the space just past her left shoulder. Your employment is terminated effective immediately due to gross violation of hospital protocol and reckless disregard for chain of command. He said, each word landing with bureaucratic precision. Elara's jaw tightened. She felt the weight of those words settle over her shoulders like a lead blanket, but her expression remained flat, unreadable. Behind her calm exterior, memory surged unbidden, the patient gasping beneath her hands, skin gray and slick with sweat. The syringe filling with dark blood as she guided the needle between ribs. The monitor's frantic screaming giving way to steady beeps. The life returning to eyes that had been fading moments before. She pushed the memory down hard, locking it behind walls built from years of practice. Crest leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking beneath his weight. He steepled his fingers and regarded her with something that might have been curiosity or might have been contempt. His next words came slower, weighted with emphasis. This hospital cannot afford a nurse who thinks she's above protocol, he said. We cannot tolerate staff who believe their judgment supersedes that of attending physicians. Department heads, the entire system designed to ensure patient safety. The word, afford, hung in the air between them like smoke. Elara heard what he didn't say, that saving a life mattered less than protecting the hospital from liability. That her years of service meant nothing weighed against the risk of a lawsuit, that she had become inconvenient. Her hands remained loose at her sides, but her fingers curled inward slightly, nails pressing against her palms. She counted her breaths. In, out, the same way she'd learned to stay calm when artillery fire shook the ground and wounded soldiers screamed in languages she didn't understand. Crest set the letter down and folded his hands over it with the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. His voice took on a practiced gentleness that was somehow worse than anger would have been. You have 15 minutes to clear out your belongings, he said. Security has been notified. They will escort you from the building for everyone's comfort. The pause before those last 3 words felt deliberate, calculated. Elara understood the implication that she was a threat now. Something to be removed swiftly and quietly before she could cause further disruption to the hospital's carefully maintained order. She nodded once, a single sharp dip of her chin that carried no submission. Just acknowledgement. Just the kind of discipline that came from understanding which battles could be won with words and which couldn't be won at all. Crest seemed unsettled by her silence. He shifted in his chair, uncrossed and recrossed his legs, picked up a pen and set it down again. Perhaps he had expected tears or anger or pleading. Instead, he got nothing but her steady gaze and the quiet acceptance of someone who had survived worse things than losing a job. Elara turned toward the door, her movements precise and controlled. Her hand found the doorknob, cold metal against her palm. She pulled the door open, stepped into the threshold, then paused. Something made her glance back over her shoulder. Crest was already looking at his computer screen, already moving on to whatever came next in his day, dismissing her before she had even left the room. Her jaw clenched hard enough that she felt the muscle jump beneath her skin. Her knuckles widened around the doorframe. Deep in her chest, beneath the exhaustion and the bitter taste of injustice, something older stirred to life. A promise she had made herself in darker places than this sterile office. A vow written in blood and sand and smoke. This would not be the last time she used these hands to save a life. She stepped into the hallway and let the door close behind her with a soft click. The corridor stretched ahead, polished linoleum reflecting the harsh fluorescent lights, the smell of antiseptic sharp in her nostrils. Other staff moved past her in their daily routines, some glancing at her with pity, others with confusion. A few with the uncomfortable relief of people grateful the axe hadn't fallen on them. Elara walked toward the locker room with steady steps, her head high, her face a mask of calm. Inside her chest, her heart beat strong and sure, the same rhythm that had carried her through combat zones and emergency rooms, through chaos and death and impossible choices. She had been fired for saving a life. But the life was saved. That was all that mattered. The staff locker room echoed with emptiness, the silence broken only by the hum of fluorescent tubes. Elara pushed through the door, the sound bouncing off tile walls and rows of dented metal lockers that lined both sides. Harsh white light cast sharp-edged shadows across the narrow space. She walked to locker 42 at the end of the row, her footsteps deliberate and measured against the floor. The combination lock turned under her fingers with familiar clicks, 3 numbers her hands knew without thought, muscle memory from years of routine. The door groaned open on worn hinges, revealing the small life she'd kept there for 5 years. Worn nursing shoes sat at the bottom, leather creased and softened from countless shifts walking endless hospital corridors. A folded photo leaned against the back wall, her and her mother years ago, faces bright with happiness that felt impossibly distant. A cheap stethoscope hung from a hook, rubber tubing cracked and brittle. That was everything. Elara unpinned her badge from her scrub top, the plastic warm from her chest. Her thumb traced over her name printed beneath her face. She pulled a manila envelope from her bag and slid the badge inside with movements that felt ceremonial. She folded the clasp, tore tape, and pressed the envelope against the inside of the locker door. A burial, sealing away a part of herself. The door burst open. Nurse Jamie Chen rushed in, face flushed, eyes wide. Jamie was young, maybe 24 years old, still believing hard work could change anything. Her sneakers squeaked as she closed the distance. "Elara, I just heard what happened. You can't just walk away," Jamie said, breathless. Her hands twisted together. "You have to fight back. File a grievance with the union. Get a lawyer. You saved that man's life. Everyone in this hospital knows you saved him." Elara pulled her work shoes from the locker and sat on the bench, metal cold through her scrub pants. She began unlacing them with slow movements. Jamie moved closer, crouching to catch her eye. "Please, Elara, don't let them do this. If they can fire you for doing the right thing, what does that mean for the rest of us? What happens the next time someone needs help? And we're too scared to act? You can't just give up." Elara slipped off one shoe, then the other, setting them beside her. Jamie's voice climbed higher. "You're the best nurse on this floor. Everyone comes to you when they don't know what to do. The residents ask for you specifically. The patients trust you. You taught half the staff how to run codes properly. This hospital needs you more than you need them." When Elara finally spoke, her voice was quiet but carried weight. She didn't look up. "Some fights you don't win in that office." Jamie opened her mouth, searching for words. "But you haven't even tried. You're just walking away. That's not like you. The Elara I know doesn't quit." "I'm not quitting," Elara said softly. "I'm accepting reality." Jamie's shoulders sagged as understanding settled over her. No amount of passion would change what had been decided by men who measured lives in liability. Elara stood and carried her shoes back to the locker, placing them inside with careful precision. She positioned them sole to sole, laces tucked inside, exactly where they'd lived for 5 years. Then she gripped the door and swung it closed. The metallic clang echoed like a cell door slamming. She spun the dial, scrambling the numbers. Jamie watched with a stricken expression. Elara picked up her canvas bag, worn from years of use, and slung it over her shoulder. That was when the vibration started. It came through the floor first, a low rumble she felt in her bones before she heard it. The sensation rolled up through her legs into her spine, deep and rhythmic, growing stronger. Metal locker doors rattled in their frames, creating a nervous chorus that filled the room. Elara's face drained of color. Blood rushed from her cheeks so fast she felt lightheaded, vision narrowing. Her bag slipped from her shoulder and hit the floor, but she didn't reach for it. Every muscle locked tight, frozen by recognition. She knew that sound. Knew it the way soldiers know incoming fire, the way prey knows a predator's footsteps. It was a sound from another life, from a place she'd spent 8 years trying to forget, the deep, pounding rhythm of heavy rotors. Cutting through air, growing closer with every beat. The vibration that had started as a distant tremor grew into something impossible to ignore. The deep, pounding rhythm intensified until ceiling tiles rattled in their frames and the building shook. The sound wasn't just heard, it was felt, a bass-heavy throb from everywhere at once. Outside, car alarms erupted in cascading waves. Inside, windows vibrated, adding a high-pitched hum over the deeper pounding from above. Staff members poured into the hallway, faces painted with confusion and fear. A cluster of nurses gathered near the station, looking up at the ceiling. Someone laughed nervously, the sound thin and uncertain. "Is this an earthquake? Does Fayetteville even get earthquakes?" a young resident asked, voice higher than normal as he steadied himself against the wall. "Earthquakes don't sound like that," another nurse said, eyes wide. "That's something else. Maybe a gas main rupture? Or construction equipment? On the roof? In the middle of a shift?" "Someone would have told us," a doctor replied, looking up nervously. "Maybe it's a helicopter," someone suggested. "That's way too loud for a medical airlift. And there's more than one." The building continued its symphony. Dust began to sift down from ventilation grates in fine streams, catching the light and creating ghostly curtains. The overhead fixtures swayed on their chains, casting moving shadows that made the hallway feel unstable. Elara stood frozen in the locker room doorway, face pale, hands clenched at her sides. While others looked around in bewilderment, her eyes had fixed on a point in space only she could see, watching a memory play out in front of her. Jamie touched her arm. "Elara, what is that? Do you know what's happening?" Elara didn't respond. She was somewhere else, trapped in a moment from 8 years ago. Then, as if pulled by an invisible thread, she began to move. She walked down the corridor with mechanical precision, footsteps steady despite the vibration. The crowd parted without knowing why, conversations dying as they watched her pass. Something in her bearing commanded space, spoke of training and purpose even as her face remained blank as stone. At the end of the hallway, a small window looked out over the city. Elara pressed her palms against the glass, the surface cold and trembling. She stared upward, breath fogging the window. 2 matte black helicopters descended through the gray sky like predatory birds. They moved with perfect synchronization, rotors creating the massive downwash that shook the building. The aircraft were unmarked, surfaces non-reflective, designed to swallow light. They settled onto the hospital roof with mechanical grace. Behind Elara, emergency lighting kicked in with a sharp click. Red lights strobed along the ceiling, casting the hallway in alternating shadows and crimson flashes. Lockdown sirens followed a harsh, oscillating wail that made several staff members cover their ears. The overhead speakers crackled to life. A male voice came through, clipped and authoritative, carrying unmistakable military cadence. "All hospital personnel, remain in your current locations. This is a security protocol. Do not attempt to leave the building or access the roof. Remain calm and await further instruction." The voice paused, then continued with devastating specificity. "Elara Quinn, report to roof access immediately. Elara Quinn to roof access." Every head in the hallway turned toward her with synchronized precision. Doctors, nurses, orderlies, patients in wheelchairs all staring at the woman standing at the window. Conversations that had been rising in panicked volume died completely, replaced by silence so profound that distant car alarms seemed to come from another world. "That's you," Jamie whispered from somewhere behind her, voice trembling. "Elara, they're calling you." "Why are they calling you? What's going on? Who is she?" someone else muttered, confusion thick in their voice. "Why would the military want a nurse?" another asked. "Maybe she's not just a nurse," a doctor said quietly. "Look at how she's standing. That's not shock. That's recognition." Elara didn't turn around. She kept her gaze fixed on the helicopters, watching as figures in tactical gear emerged from the aircraft, movements efficient and purposeful. Her reflection in the glass showed a face emptied of emotion, a mask revealing nothing of whatever storm raged inside. Someone whispered her name like a question. Another voice joined it, then another, until her name became a murmur rippling through the crowd. But Elara remained still as carved stone, palms flat against the trembling window, watching as her past descended from the sky to reclaim her. The security guard's voice cut through the crowd, sharp despite the tremor beneath it. "Everyone stay back. This is an active security situation." The stairwell door exploded outward with a metallic crash. A squad of soldiers poured through in precise formation, tactical gear matte black and bristling with equipment. They moved with synchronized efficiency, boots striking the floor in rhythm, heads turning in calculated sweeps as they scanned every face. These were not medical transport escorts. These men carried themselves with coiled readiness, hands resting near weapons. The crowd pressed back against the walls, creating empty space down the center. At the front, Sergeant Cade Marin came to a halt. His eyes swept across frightened faces with methodical precision, moving from person to person with the practiced assessment of someone trained to identify targets in crowds. Then his gaze locked onto Elara, and his posture changed instantly. His shoulders squared, his jaw set, relief flickering across weathered features. He pulled a tablet from his vest, screen glowing blue in the red emergency lighting. His eyes dropped to it for 3 seconds, then lifted back to Elara's face, comparing image with reality. Satisfied, he slid the tablet back and began walking toward her, each step deliberate and unwavering. The soldiers fanned out behind him, creating a perimeter that herded onlookers back. Marin's boots struck the floor with steady rhythm, somehow audible despite the sirens and confused voices. He stopped 3 feet from Elara, close enough that she could see fine lines around his eyes carved by years of squinting into desert sun, gray threading through close-cropped hair. A small scar above his left eyebrow that looked like it came from shrapnel. His voice carried the gravelly tone of someone who'd spent years shouting over gunfire and rotor wash. Elara Quinn. Unit designation Falcon 7. Deployed to Kandahar Province, October 2014 through March 2016. Desert callsign Needle. The effect was like a physical blow. Elara's breath caught audibly, her pale face going lighter. Behind her, the crowd erupted in whispers, shocked voices layering over each other. No civilian should know those details. No hospital record would contain that information. Jamie's voice rose above the others, thin with shock. "Elara, what is he talking about? You were deployed? Why didn't you tell anyone?" "She was a combat medic," someone else whispered, the realization spreading. "Why didn't she say anything? We worked with her for years." "Because people like her don't talk about it," a doctor replied quietly. "Look at her face. Whatever she did there wasn't something she wanted to remember." "Falcon 7 sounds like special operations," another nurse murmured. "Forward combat medicine," the doctor said. "The ones who go in with the troops." Marin ignored the whispers, attention fixed on Elara. He stepped closer, lowering his voice, though his words carried to those nearest. "Commander Dorian Hale is dying, Quinn. Shrapnel near the heart, bleeding they can't stop. Without you, he won't see sunrise. He asked for you specifically. Said you're the only one who can do what needs to be done." For a single heartbeat, Elara stood perfectly still. Her eyes searched Marin's face as if looking for a lie, for some escape. Her hands opened and closed at her sides, fingers flexing with muscle memory of procedures she'd tried to forget. Old fear flickered across her features, not fear of danger, but fear of being pulled back into a world she'd fought to leave. Fear that once she went with them, there would be no civilian life to return to. Then, with a movement that seemed to cost her something vital, she bent down and picked up her canvas bag. She slung it over her shoulder with practiced ease, the gesture automatic and ingrained. When she looked up at Marin again, her face had shifted into something harder, older. A mask settling into place that transformed her from nurse to soldier in the space between breaths. She didn't speak, she simply gave one sharp nod. Marin returned the nod and turned, gesturing for his squad to open a path. As Elara stepped forward to follow, her eyes held something that made the watching crowd fall. Silent, not resignation, but terrible acceptance, the look of someone walking back into fire they'd barely escaped the first time, knowing the flames might not let them go again. The rooftop door burst open and Elara stepped into a wall of wind. Helicopter rotors churned the air into violent maelstrom, tearing at her hair and whipping her scrubs. The noise was overwhelming, a deep throb that vibrated through her chest. Soldiers flanked her on both sides, guiding her across the rooftop toward the matte black Blackhawk squatting like a predator in the center. The aircraft's open bay yawned before her, dark and waiting. Marin went first, swinging up with practiced ease, then extended a hand down. Elara took it, his grip strong and calloused, and let him pull her into the helicopter's interior. The moment she crossed the threshold, 6 pairs of eyes locked onto her with startling intensity. The soldiers inside were young, most barely into their 20s, faces still soft with youth. But there was nothing soft in how they looked at her. They stared with curiosity and something deeper reverence, recognition of something they'd only heard in stories. One of them, a kid with freckles and corporal stripes, leaned toward his buddy and whispered, "That's her. That's the medic from Falcon. The one they said died in the ambush." "No way," the other soldier breathed, eyes widening. "I heard she saved like 30 guys before they pulled her out. I heard she did surgery in the back of a moving truck while taking fire. She's the reason Hale's still alive the first time," another voice added from across the bay. Elara felt their stares like pressure, each whispered word adding weight to the identity she'd tried to shed. She'd spent 8 years building a life where no one knew what these hands had done. Marin pressed a headset into her hands. She pulled it on, and the world became clearer as noise cancellation cut through the rotor wash. "Quinn, you reading me?" Marin's voice came through, tinny but clear. "I read you," she said, her voice strange after the silence she'd maintained in the hospital. Marin pulled a tablet from his vest and held it toward her. Alara's eyes tracked across the data with automatic efficiency. Vitals scrolled down the left, heart rate erratic and climbing, blood pressure dropping, oxygen saturation borderline. The CT scan showed shrapnel lodged between ribs, millimeters from the pericardium. "Shrapnel near the heart," Marin said, finger tracing the screen. "Bleeding they can't stop. Every time they try to move him, he crashes. Evacuation impossible. He's got maybe 6 hours. 8 if he's lucky." "What's the location?" she asked, calculating approaches, weighing risks. 20 minutes out. Field surgical setup waiting, but Quinn, nobody there knows how to do what you did. They're good, but they're not Falcon good. Equipment status? Full trauma kit. Whatever you need, we requisitioned. Hale made sure of it before he went down. Blood supply? 40 units on site. Oh neg. More coming if you need it. Alara's jaw tightened as she studied the scan. Then something on Marin's shoulder caught her eye. The unit patch. Black background, red Falcon in flight, wings spread wide. Falcon 7. The same patch she'd worn for 18 months. Suddenly she wasn't on the helicopter anymore. She was back in burning alleyways of a foreign city, smoke thick enough to choke on, gunfire echoing off mud brick walls. She could smell cordite and blood, feel the weight of a dying soldier in her arms, hear herself screaming for cover. While she worked with hands slick with blood that kept pouring. "Quinn?" Marin's voice pulled her back. "You still with me?" Elara blinked, the present reasserting itself. The helicopter. The mission. Hale dying somewhere ahead. "I'm here," she said, though part of her was still back in those alleyways. The helicopter lurched as it lifted off, movement smooth but unmistakable. Through the open bay door, Elara watched the hospital drop away, building growing smaller with each second. She could see the parking lot where her car sat, the locker room where she'd sealed away her badge. She'd spent 8 years building that life. 8 years convincing herself she could be ordinary, someone who clocked in and out and went home to a quiet apartment. 8 years pretending the war hadn't marked her permanently. And now, in one helicopter flight, she was leaving it all behind. Worse, she'd chosen to leave. Walked onto this aircraft knowing what it meant. If she failed, if Hale died under her hands, there would be no going back. The military would own her again, and this time they might never let her go. The hospital disappeared behind the curve of buildings, and Elara turned her face forward, toward whatever waited ahead. Feeling the last threads of her civilian life snap one by one in the rotor wash. The helicopter descended toward harsh white light that carved the forward base out of darkness. Banks of floodlights threw stark shadows across the compound, and as the skids touched down, Elara could see the chaos of a field medical station in full operation. Stretchers lined the ground. Medics in blood-stained scrubs moved between them with controlled urgency, voices cutting through the generator roar. Elara dropped from the bay, boots hitting packed earth. The smell hit her: disinfectant and diesel, sweat and blood, the metallic tang of field hospitals. It settled into her lungs like it had never left. She took 3 steps when a voice cut through the noise, familiar in a way that made her heart stop. Quinn? Oh my God, Quinn. Marcus Venn ran toward her, face twisted between disbelief and joy. He was older now, lines carved deeper around his eyes, but the way he moved was exactly the same: the slight hitch in his left leg from old shrapnel. The forward lean of someone who'd spent years sprinting toward danger. He reached her and stopped 3 feet away, hands coming up as if to grab her shoulders. Then dropping again as if he didn't believe she was real enough to touch. They told us you were dead, he said, voice cracking. After the ambush, when they pulled survivors out, you weren't with them. We searched for 3 days. Hale himself went back twice looking for you. We thought you were gone. Marcus, Elara said quietly, the name strange after 8 years of silence. Another figure materialized behind Jalen Crow, thinner than she remembered, face gaunt but intense. His eyes were wet, catching the floodlights as he moved closer. We held a memorial for you, Crow said, voice thick with emotion. 3 months after the ambush, when they called off the search. As far as Falcon knew, you died out there. Hale gave the eulogy himself. We put your name on the wall with the others. The words landed like physical blows. Elara felt something crack inside her chest, the careful walls she'd built fracturing. These men had carried her death with them for 8 years. They'd mourned her. I got out, she said, the words inadequate. I got out and I kept going. Ven's face crumpled for a second before training reasserted itself. He nodded once, sharp and military, then grabbed her arm. Come on. Hale's coding every 20 minutes. If you're going to save him, it needs to be now. They pulled her toward the largest tent at the center, the one with red crosses on white canvas. Inside, the air was cooler, filtered through portable AC units. Medical equipment lined improvised shelving, and in the center, surrounded by IV stands and monitors, lay Commander Dorian Hale. His skin was gray, slick with sweat. The monitors screamed warnings, showing vitals dancing on the edge of sustainability. His chest rose and fell in shallow jerks, each breath looking like it cost him something vital. Elara moved to his side, eyes tracking to the central monitor. Heart rate erratic, jumping from 60 to 120. Blood pressure barely holding at 80/40 despite 3 pressors. Oxygen saturation at 88%. A medic handed her a tablet, and Elara pulled up the imaging. The CT scan filled the screen, and her stomach dropped. The shrapnel sat between his 3rd and 4th ribs, but it wasn't the clean puncture she'd hoped for. The fragment had tumbled as it entered, creating a jagged wound track that tore through tissue in multiple directions. Worse, it had nicked the pericardium, and blood was slowly accumulating in that space, compressing the heart with every beat. This is different from last time, she said, not taking her eyes from the scan. The technique I used before won't work here. The trajectory is wrong. Can you still do it? Venn asked, voice tight with barely controlled fear. The shrapnel has to come out at exactly the right angle or it tears the pericardium completely, she said, still studying the image. One wrong move and he bleeds out in seconds. I'd need perfect conditions. We have whatever you need, Crow interrupted. Equipment, personnel, blood supply. Hale made sure of everything before he went down. But you can do it, Venn said. It wasn't a question, more like a plea disguised as certainty. Elara stared at the scan, fingers gripping the tablet's edges until her knuckles went white. This was worse than anything she'd seen in the field, worse than the worst trauma bay nightmare. Behind her, she could hear Venn and Crow breathing, waiting for her to say something, to confirm she could do this. But for the first time in her career, Elara Quinn wasn't sure she could. Elara stood at the improvised sink, water splashing over her hands as she scrubbed. Her eyes fixed on her knuckles, on the thin white scars that traced across the skin like a map of every procedure she'd done under fire. Each scar was a ghost. A young medic approached with sterile gloves. Elara dried her hands and pulled them on, feeling the tight grip of latex, the way her fingers slid into place with muscle memory so deep it hurt. This was who she'd been before hospitals and badge numbers. The operating area had been set up in the center of the tent, portable surgical lights casting harsh illumination. Hale lay in that circle, chest exposed and prepped, skin painted orange. The monitors beeped, measuring the distance between life and death. Elara stepped into the light and scanned the faces around the table, making instant assessments. Ven, you're on vitals. Updates every 30 seconds: heart rate, pressure, oxygen sat. If anything changes, you tell me before the monitor does. Marcus Ven moved to the head of the table, hands reaching for the monitoring equipment. Crow, instruments. I call it, you hand it to me, no hesitation. Think ahead of what I'll need next. Jalen Crow positioned himself at the instrument tray, fingers hovering over the sterile array laid out in precise order. The rest of you watch and learn, Elara said to the young medics pressed against the tent walls. I'm going to narrate every step. If Hale crashes and I'm too busy to talk, you stay silent and stay out of my way. Understood? A chorus of affirmatives rippled through the crowd. Elara turned back to Hale, picked up the scalpel, and made the first incision. Blood welled up immediately. She worked quickly to control it with gauze and suction, hands moving with fluid precision. Incision through the intercostal space between ribs 3 and 4. Minimal cutting, we preserve as much tissue as possible. Retractors now, Crow. The retractors slid into her palm and she positioned them, spreading the wound to reveal tissue beneath. She could see the pericardium now, and there visible through the membrane was the dark shadow of accumulated blood. That was when the monitor began to scream. Hale's heart rate spiked from 80 to 160 in 3 seconds, rhythm fracturing into chaos as ventricular fibrillation took hold. The organized beat shattered into electrical anarchy. He's crashing, Ven shouted, hands already reaching for the defibrillator. Elara's mind went ice cold and diamond sharp. She stepped back from the table, hands coming up to give Ven room. Charging to 200. Everyone clear. The defibrillator whined as it built charge. Ven positioned the paddles on Hale's chest, careful to avoid the open wound. Clear, Elara said, voice cutting through the panic. The shock hit Hale's body with a jolt that made him arch off the table. The monitor flatlined for one eternal second, then the rhythm returned weak and irregular but there. Sinus rhythm, rate 60, pressure 70/40 and climbing, Ven called out, relief making his voice shake. Elara stepped back to the table, mind racing, recalculating. The technique she'd planned wouldn't work. Hale was too unstable. She needed something faster. Listen carefully, she said, and the tent went silent. I'm going to do something I've never done before. Partial cardiac window to visualize the injury, hemostatic gauze buffer to control bleeding, field cauterization to seal vessels as I go. Then I extract the shrapnel in one pull. If I'm wrong about the angle, he dies. If I hesitate, he dies. If my hand slips a millimeter, he dies. She reached for the instruments, narrating each step. Scalpel to open the pericardium. Gauze positioned to catch blood. Cautery to seal small vessels. And then she was there, forceps positioned around the jagged metal fragment. She could feel its weight through the instruments, sense the angle at which it had embedded itself. One pull, one chance. Her hands began to tremble. It was barely visible, just a fine tremor in her fingers, but in the absolute stillness required for this extraction, it might as well have been an earthquake. Elara stared at her hands, at the slight shaking that 8 years of civilian life had never produced. She was afraid, not of dying, but of this, of having a life in her hands again, of being the only thing standing between a man and death. For the first time in her career, her hands trembled. But she didn't pull away. She took one breath, then another, forcing air into lungs that wanted to lock tight. She felt the tremor in her fingers, acknowledged it, and let it pass through her like wind through grass. Her hands steadied. Extracting now, she said, and pulled. The shrapnel came free in a single smooth motion, the jagged metal sliding from tissue with resistance. Elara felt through the forceps. For one heartbeat, she thought they'd made it clean. Then the blood came. It erupted from the wound in a terrifying gush, flooding the surgical field faster than suction could clear it. Every eye locked on the blood pooling in Hale's chest cavity. But Elara's hands were already moving. She packed the wound with hemostatic gauze, fingers working with mechanical precision. The cautery came up in her other hand, the smell of burning tissue filling the air as she sealed vessels one by one. Pressure holding, Ven called out, voice tight. Heart rate stabilizing at 90. Blood pressure climbing 85/50 and rising. Elara didn't respond. More packing. More cautery. Her hands moved in small, precise motions. The bleeding slowed from a flood to a trickle, then to nothing. The surgical field cleared, revealing tissue that was traumatized but intact, a heart that continued to beat. She stepped back from the table and watched the monitors. The numbers climbed with agonizing slowness, blood pressure creeping toward normal, oxygen saturation rising, heart rate settling into sustainable rhythm. The tent held its breath, listening to the steady beeping that reclaimed the silence one pulse at a time. He's stable, Crow said, the words coming out like a prayer. Elara set down her instruments, pulled off her gloves, and walked out without a word. Behind her, medics erupted into motion, but she kept walking until she reached the tent edge, staring at nothing and feeling the adrenaline drain. Hours later, in the recovery area, Hale opened his eyes. Elara sat beside his cot, watching the monitors, and didn't notice he was awake until his hand moved. His fingers found her wrist, closing around it with the grip of someone afraid she might disappear. Quinn, he rasped, voice rough from intubation. His eyes were glassy with medication but focused with intensity. Don't talk, Elara said quietly. You just had major surgery. You need to rest. 8 years, Hale said, ignoring her completely. His grip tightened. 8 years I've been fighting to get your name cleared. To get your work recognized. They buried the after-action report from the ambush. Classified it to protect careers, hide bad intelligence. But I kept pushing. Kept your file active. Kept looking for you. Elara stared at him, feeling something crack open in her chest. The procedures you developed saved hundreds of lives, Hale continued, each word costing him effort. But they credited them to other people. Put other names on the patents. I've been fighting to fix that. To bring you back the right way. Commander, you need to rest, Elara said, but her voice had gone soft. You saved my life twice now, Hale said, his eyes drifting closed even as his hand remained on her wrist. The debt's mine to pay, not yours. His grip loosened as unconsciousness reclaimed him, and Elara sat there feeling the weight of 8 years crash down on her shoulders. She walked out into the cold night air. The forward base spread out around her in pools of light, generators rumbling. In the distance, she could hear artillery fire, could see helicopter running lights. The sounds of war, familiar as a heartbeat. This success had made her visible again. Every medic would tell the story. The legend of Needle would spread like wildfire, and with it would come questions about where she'd been. Footsteps approached. Elara turned to see Marin walking toward her with a tablet. His face was neutral, but she could read the tension in his shoulders. Command wants to see you in D.C. As soon as you land, he said, holding out the tablet so she could see the orders displayed. They're sending a transport in the morning. Direct flight, no stops. Elara looked at the glowing screen and felt the last threads of her civilian life snap. The surgery had been the beginning. Now came the reckoning questions about the buried report, the hidden innovations, the 8 years as a ghost. When do we leave? She asked, her voice hollow. 0600. That gives you 4 hours to clean up and debrief the surgical team. Will Hale be stable for transport? Medical team says he needs 48 hours minimum before he can fly. You'll be going without him. She'd saved Hale's life, but in doing so, she'd lost the anonymity that had kept her safe from the system that had used her. Understood, she said, the word tasting like ashes. Marin nodded and walked away, leaving her alone under cold stars, listening to distant rotors and wondering if she'd just traded one cage for another. The secure conference room in the Pentagon smelled of leather and old coffee, walls lined with portraits. Whose eyes seemed to follow Elara as she walked to the chair at the center of the long table. 3 generals sat across from her, uniforms heavy with ribbons that spoke of decades climbing the hierarchy. General Patricia Hawthorne, the senior officer, folded her hands on the table and looked at Elara with eyes that had seen too many wars to offer warmth. The after-action report from the Falcon ambush was classified, Hawthorne said, each word measured. We buried it to protect careers. To hide intelligence failures. Your name disappeared with that report, Quinn. Elara sat perfectly still, hands folded, face a mask. Inside, something cold and sharp settled into her chest. A colonel stepped forward and activated the wall screen. Numbers appeared in neat columns, graphs showing trajectories that climbed steadily upward over 8 years. Lives saved, procedures implemented, innovations adopted across military medical facilities worldwide. These are lives saved by your innovations, the colonel said. The hemostatic packing technique. The field cardiac window approach. Dozens of lives in the first year. Hundreds by year 3. Nearly 1,000 combat saves. The laser dot moved to another section, and Elara felt her jaw tighten as she read the names listed there. Doctors she'd never met. Surgeons who'd published papers describing their techniques. Military physicians decorated for innovations born in the back of transport trucks while bullets tore through metal. All credited to other people. All published under other names, Hawthorne said, sounding like the words tasted bitter. Your work, Quinn, but their recognition. The third general, Barrett, leaned forward with the posture of someone delivering good news, voice. Carrying the false heartiness of a man trying to sell absolution. Full reinstatement with rank of captain. Back pay for 8 years. And you'd head combat medical doctrine design. Authority to develop new procedures, train the next generation, shape how we save lives for 20 years. He slid a folder across the table, the leather binder thick with paperwork. Elara didn't touch it. Everything you've earned, Hawthorne added. Everything they took from you. The door opened, and Elara turned to see Director Lionel Crest being ushered in by an aide who quickly disappeared. He looked diminished, expensive suit hanging on a frame that seemed to have shrunk since she'd last seen him in his office. His face was pale, slick with sweat despite the cool air, and his eyes darted between the generals and Elara with trapped desperation. He cleared his throat twice before words came out. Miss Quinn, he said, voice cracking. The board has authorized me to offer you head of emergency medicine. Full authority. Complete autonomy. We recognize the termination was your talents would be better. Stop, Elara said, the word cutting through his stammering. Crest's mouth snapped shut. The room went silent except for the low hum of air conditioning. Elara stood slowly, chair scraping against the floor. She looked at the generals arrayed before her, then at Crest standing by the door like a prisoner awaiting sentencing. Then back at the folder that promised to return everything stolen from her. She thought about the hospital where she'd spent 5 years trying to be ordinary. She thought about the military that had used her innovations and buried her name. She thought about systems that measured people in terms of liability and political convenience, that threw away what they couldn't control. And claimed credit for what they hadn't created. She thought about 8 years of running, 8 years of pretending. She was someone else, 8 years of believing that if she made herself small enough and quiet enough, she could escape the machinery that ground people down. The generals watched with patient confidence. Crest watched with desperate hope. The room waited for her to say yes, to accept what they offered, to slide back into the role they'd prepared. Elara looked at them all, the uniforms heavy with unearned authority, the suit damp with guilty sweat, and spoke the one word neither side expected to hear. No. The word hung in the air, and the silence that followed was absolute. The kind of silence that came when the world shifted in ways no one had anticipated and everything that had seemed certain suddenly wasn't. 6 months had passed, and Elara Quinn walked onto the stage of a modest training auditorium with steps that carried confidence she'd never felt before. The auditorium seated 200, every seat filled with medics. Nurses and paramedics in mixed uniforms, military fatigues beside civilian scrubs beside fire department blues, all turned toward the stage with focused attention. Behind Elara, mounted on the wall, hung a framed falcon patch, black background, red falcon in flight. Beneath it, a brass plaque held words that made something in her chest loosen, in honor of the unknown medic who refused to let us die, now known. Elara stopped at the simulation rig that dominated the stage. The medical dummy lay on a tilted table, chest exposed, surrounded by monitors and instrument trays. She looked out at the sea of faces and saw herself reflected in every one, people who'd chosen to step into the gap between life and death. Good morning. I'm Elara Quinn, and I'm here to teach you a procedure that might save a life when everything else has failed. Protocol will save 99% of your patients. I'm teaching you what to do when you're in that 1%. She paused, making eye contact with individuals scattered through the crowd, letting the weight of that statement settle over them like a physical thing. When the textbook answer isn't working and the patient is dying anyway, you choose follow the rules or follow your instinct. Elara's hands moved to the rig, positioning instruments with muscle memory built from hundreds of procedures. She began the demonstration, narrating each step with clinical precision layered over human context, explaining not just the mechanics but the reasoning. Her fingers worked through the procedure with the fluid grace of practice while she talked about reading vitals in real time. Trusting your hands when your eyes couldn't see everything, understanding that sometimes the situation demanded innovation over orthodoxy. Judgment, she said, sealing a simulated vessel. That separates a good medic from a great one. The ability to know what a situation needs. She demonstrated the packing technique, the cauterization approach, the rapid assessment process that let medics prioritize multiple injuries in seconds. The room stayed silent except for her voice and the monitor's soft beeping, 200 pairs of eyes tracking every movement of her hands. She moved into the extraction phase, her fingers working with the precision that had saved Hale's life 6 months ago. Instinct, built from experience and knowledge. You learn it here, making mistakes on dummies instead of people. She pulled the simulated shrapnel free with smooth, controlled precision that made the movement look effortless. Even though every trainee in the room knew how much could go wrong in that single second. She stepped back from the completed procedure, letting them see the final result. And responsibility. When you use these techniques, the outcome is yours. The class erupted into questions, and Elara spent the next hour walking them through variations and complications. When the session ended and the crowd filtered out, Elara found an envelope on the podium, her name in handwriting she recognized. She opened it standing alone on the empty stage. Quinn retiring from active duty. Doctor says the heart won't take another deployment. But I'm not tired of saving lives. If your program has room for an old commander, I'd like to spend the rest of my life paying back what you gave me time. Hale. Elara folded the letter carefully and slipped it into her pocket, a small smile touching her mouth. She walked through the empty auditorium, pushing through the exterior doors into afternoon sunlight. The sound reached her before she saw it, the deep, rhythmic pounding of rotors. A helicopter passed overhead, close enough that she could see the pilot's silhouette, moving with purpose toward whatever mission waited. Elara stopped and looked up, watching it cross the sky. The sound that had once dragged her back to burning alleys and screaming soldiers now sounded different. It sounded like a tool she'd chosen to pick up again. Like a mission that belonged to her, not to the system that had tried to bury her. Like the beginning of something she'd built with her own hands. The helicopter disappeared beyond the buildings, and Elara turned back toward the training center. Already thinking about tomorrow's class, about Hale's letter, about the next generation of medics she'd helped shape. For the first time in 8 years, the sound of rotors meant something other than war. It meant home, when life gives us only a few moments to act. Some people choose courage, even when no one is watching. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you know someone who deserves a second chance, feel free to share this video with them. For more true-to-life stories of resilience, hope, and the quiet heroes among us, please consider joining our community. Your support helps these stories live on. Thank you for watching. This has been Golden Heart Stories.